It was early morning on September 15th, 1916. Thick mist hung over the muddy fields near the French village of Flers. The sound of artillery had become so normal that soldiers barely noticed it anymore. But this morning was different. The ground began to shake, not from shells, but from something heavy, crawling forward through the fog. British troops watched in awe. German soldiers peered over their trenches, confused, and then out of the smoke they appeared, massive iron machines grinding across the battlefield, crushing barbed wire like it was nothing. For the first time in human history, tanks were rolling into combat. By 1916, World War I had become a living nightmare. Across the Western Front, millions of men faced each other in a maze of trenches that stretched hundreds of miles. The war had slowed to a brutal stalemate, months of bloodshed for just a few hundred yards of land. Machine guns ruled the battlefield, cutting down anyone who dared to advance. Artillery churned the earth into a wasteland. Soldiers charged through mud, barbed wire, and poison gas, only to fall in waves before reaching enemy lines. It became painfully clear that courage alone could not break the deadlock. Britain's military command needed something new, a weapon that could cross trenches, survive bullets, and crush defenses that had made traditional tactics useless. Out of that desperation, the idea of the tank was born. The concept of an armored fighting vehicle wasn't entirely new. Sketches of land battleships had been imagined before the war. But turning that fantasy into reality took courage, secrecy, and engineering brilliance. In 1915, a small group of British engineers, naval officers, and military thinkers formed what was called the Landships Committee. Their mission: to design a tracked armored vehicle capable of crossing the deadly no-man's land of the Western Front. To keep the project hidden from spies, they used a simple trick. When crates of parts were shipped to testing grounds, they were labeled tanks, as if they were containers for water. The name stuck, and soon even the engineers themselves were calling their secret weapon by its code name, the tank. The early prototypes were clumsy and unreliable, but each version taught the team something new. By early 1916, they had produced a working model, the Mark I, the first true tank in history. The Mark I didn't look like a modern tank. It was a long, rhomboid-shaped vehicle with tracks running all the way around its body. That shape allowed it to climb over obstacles and trenches that would stop any normal vehicle. It moved slowly, just 3 to 4 miles per hour, but it could cross shell craters, crush barbed wire, and roll over enemy trenches. There were two versions of the Mark I. The male tank carried 2 6-pounder naval guns and 4 machine guns. The female tank carried only machine guns but was faster and better at suppressing enemy infantry. Each tank carried a crew of 8 men who worked in unbearable conditions. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, oil, and heat. Temperatures could rise over 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The noise from the engine was deafening, and the smell of gasoline mixed with the stench of sweat and metal. The crew had to steer the tank using a system of gears, levers, and cables that required immense physical effort. There were no radios, so communication was done by shouting or knocking on the armor. Visibility was poor. The crew peered through small slits in the steel plates, knowing that a single bullet or piece of shrapnel could slip through and kill them instantly. It was a metal coffin on tracks, but to the soldiers outside, it looked unstoppable. By September, 1916, the British were in the middle of the Somme offensive, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the war. The plan for September 15th was ambitious. Use tanks to lead the infantry assault and break through the German defenses near the village of Flers. 49 tanks were brought to the front, but even before the attack began, many failed. Some broke down. Others got stuck in mud or were too slow to reach the start line. At dawn, only around 22 to 25 tanks were able to move forward, and just about 15 actually reached the German lines. But those few tanks changed everything. When the first machines appeared through the mist, German soldiers were stunned. Some tried firing rifles and machine guns. The bullets simply bounced off the armor. Others panicked and fled, calling them monsters or iron houses. The tanks crushed barbed wire, rolled over trenches, and opened paths for British infantry to follow. Villages like Flers were captured, the first time tanks had ever helped take ground in history. One officer reportedly shouted, "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind it." For a few brief hours it seemed like the impossible had happened. The trenches were broken. But victory didn't come easily. The early tanks were far from perfect. Many broke down within minutes. Their engines overheated, their tracks snapped, and mud clogged the moving parts. German artillery soon adapted, targeting the slow-moving machines with direct hits. A single shell could destroy a tank completely. Inside, the crews suffered terribly. Some fainted from heat or fumes. Others were burned or killed when shells penetrated the thin armor. Still, the tank had proven its worth. Even though the attack at Courcelette wasn't a massive breakthrough, it showed that the tank could do what men and horses could not: move forward under fire. The machine had weaknesses, but its potential was undeniable. For the Germans, the sight of the first tanks was horrifying. They had never been told such a weapon existed. Soldiers described seeing metal monsters crawling out of the earth. Some called them unheimliche Wagen, uncanny wagons. Others believed they were new British secret weapons that nothing could stop. Panic spread quickly in certain areas. German commanders initially thought the reports were exaggerated until they saw the wrecks themselves. One officer wrote that his men stood in disbelief as these machines crossed trenches as if they were nothing. Although many tanks were knocked out, the psychological effect was enormous. The Germans began urgently developing anti-tank weapons such as armor-piercing bullets and field guns, and later even built their own tank, the A-7V, but it came too late to change the war. After the battle, British commanders realized they had stumbled upon something revolutionary, but they also saw the flaws. The Mark III was underpowered, unreliable, and poorly ventilated. Communication between tanks and infantry was chaotic. Crews often didn't know where they were going. Engineers went back to work, determined to fix the problems. They designed improved versions, the Mark II, Mark IV, and eventually the Mark V, each more reliable and better armed than the last. By 1917, tanks were being used in larger numbers and with better planning. At the Battle of Cambrai later that year, over 400 tanks attacked together for the first time, and this time they broke through German lines in spectacular fashion. For the first time in the war, British forces advanced miles in a single day. The age of trench warfare was ending. The age of armored warfare had begun. The debut of the tank at Courcelette wasn't perfect, But it changed military thinking forever. No longer would infantry alone decide the outcome of battles. From now on, machines would lead the charge. Every major army studied what had happened in 1916. After the war, nations poured money into developing better armored vehicles. By World War II, tanks had become faster, deadlier, and more mobile, the centerpiece of modern warfare. When German forces unleashed their blitzkrieg in 1939, they were using tactics born directly from lessons learned at Flers. The first tanks may have been crude, but they started a revolution. Behind every tank was a crew, men who risked their lives inside those steel coffins. Eyewitness accounts from Imperial War Museum archives describe what it was like. Men fainting from fumes, their clothes soaked with oil and sweat, steering the vehicle blind through chaos. In one report, a tank commander said he couldn't hear his own gunfire because the noise inside was so loud it felt like being inside a factory explosion that never stopped. And yet, these crews pressed forward, knowing that every meter they gained could save hundreds of infantry lives behind them. Their courage laid the foundation for the armored units that would define the next century of war. Today, when we think of tanks, sleek, powerful machines dominating modern battlefields, it's hard to imagine that it all began with clumsy, smoke-belching giants barely able to move. But those early pioneers proved something vital. In war, innovation can be more powerful than numbers. The tank's first appearance on that misty September morning didn't end the war, but it changed the future of every war to come. It was the moment humanity learned that the battlefield no longer belonged only to men. It now belonged to machines.